Welcome back to the Pursuit Podcast. Today, we're going to be taking a look at GDPR, what those four letters even mean, why you should be scared, or hopefully a little bit less scared by the end of the episode, and what you can do to remain compliant. I'm your host, Jessica Rose, and I'm here today with
Gilbert Hill.
Gilbert, what do you do?
I'm the CEO of TapMyData, which is a privacy-centric startup. We've built a mobile data rights platform.
Oh, this is all very exciting. So you're explicitly working in the privacy space.
That's right, yes. We're hoping that we're going to be part of a sort of an ecosystem which is starting to grow, and there's a real need for privacy-centric tech, a tech stack to match what we're used to with ad tech.
That's very exciting. Sort of the prospect of like, hey, maybe the future could be slightly less dystopian.
Exactly. I think we've got to the point at the moment where we're starting to see the logical conclusion of both increasingly invasive technology and also an approach to monetizing data, which has simply been to get all the data and to store it as cheaply and hopefully securely as possible, work out what to do with it later. But there's a need to actually have tools to mitigate that. Think about it like we've got a situation where we've got a lot of like data spent fuel rods. What do we do with that now?
It's a really, really interesting question. And our dear listener probably works in tech, so they may be fairly familiar with the fact that we're living in sort of the end times of privacy almost, if that doesn't sound like too panicked, where it feels like a lot of things you do online, a lot of things you do with different platforms are just sucking up that data and trading it all over the world. Let's dive into GDPR. GDPR was designed to stop this a little, maybe?
I think, like a lot of people, I got into sort of privacy and got exposed to GDPR by mistake. I'm a technologist, so I got used to tools that picked up data and used it like cookies as simply functional things. I didn't realize that they were contributing to almost this sort of like privacy end of days scenario that you were talking about, where they were being used to build profiles of web users, track them around the web, and part of a sort of a multi-billion-dollar industry of behavioral advertising. And I think we've been in a situation where tech has been moving so fast. You can look at things like wearables, and the acquisition of data has been so massive that we've all become part of this. Companies have realized the value of data. And there's that really overused analogy of data is the new oil. So we've all built up huge lakes of the stuff, and we're trying to work out what to do with it down the line. But there's been a failure, firstly, for how we treat people as citizens and as humans to keep pace with the technology. And I think GDPR is not about stopping the data economy. It's about trying to rewrite that balance. And also, one thing that's often overlooked with GDPR, I think it's been seen as strictly a privacy-centric regulation. But the idea behind it was to create, at least in Europe, a level playing field. You've got a situation where the preeminent data platforms are approaching monopolistic status, that if you have sort of free passporting of data, then it gives an ecosystem for smaller entrants to come in. And we're starting to see the beginnings of that in things like search. So I think GDPR, I disagree that privacy is dead, even though I've heard it. I think we all overuse Star Wars analogies, but I think it's like the Rebel Alliance is starting to coalesce here. And GDPR gives them a platform to do this. The best way to think of GDPR really is as a framework. If you start to dive into the minutiae of it, there are 99 articles of densely worded legalese. It's been exclusively the preserve of privacy lawyers, and now it's been around with us over a year. We're starting to see it increasing as a framework, and it's the closest thing that the world has right now, a platform to ethically capture, manage, and yes, monetize data. So it shouldn't be anathema to technologists of the business community that pays our salaries.
So this is all really exciting. I'm going to grab you. Well, I'm going to verbally grab you and pull you backwards a little bit. So this is all really, really interesting information about how we could view GDPR and what kind of context it sort of came up in, and what maybe you and maybe some other folks out there, our personal hopes are for it. But let's step way back. What is GDPR for folks who do less work in privacy or who are outside the European Union?
Sure. GDPR is an overarching regulation which basically means that if you are doing anything with data, if you're processing data, that's doing anything with data that gives its value. That could be obviously capturing data, it could be slicing and dicing data, it could be selling data, or it could be simply hosting data, then you are affected by GDPR. And I think what GDPR means is, introduced in May of last year, is that you have to comply with 99 articles which cover that whole life cycle around data. So I think what it requires anyone who has anything to do with data is to look at their existing processes and to document what they're doing with data, look at the risks around that, and enshrine some of the rights of citizens. Now, it pertains particularly to EU citizens, and there's often a bit of misunderstanding that it only applies within the geographic bounds of the EU. So, for example, like a Brexited Britain or a company that's domiciled in the US, GDPR doesn't apply. That's not the case. If you are dealing with the data of EU citizens or anyone who's currently in the EU, then you need to comply with the requirements of GDPR. Now, as I've mentioned before, there are 99 articles. They're varied and detailed and numerous and complex. But I think the best way to start it is to look at this sort of cycle of auditing, of discovering what data you're using and thereby identifying the risk associated with that data. Until now, you've only seen it as an upside. It's all been gravy. Like, we've got the data, it's going to be worth money down the line. Now we're realizing without due diligence and husbandry around that data, it can start to turn toxic. But you have to start to manage that data. And then finally, at the moment, we're all doing deals with data, and GDPR enshrines that you have to disclose what you're doing with data. And I think the key thing that started to come out in the last year or so, and this is something that the UK regulator, the ICO, led by Elizabeth Denham, has said, a lot of this getting to grips with GDPR is going to take time, but the first thing that you can do is to enshrine and show accountability in your organization. That's a new thing with GDPR. Lots of the stuff in GDPR was already in existing regulations, but this is a new thing. It's not enough. I mean, you were talking earlier about how do we comply with GDPR. Actually, it's about going beyond compliance and our sort of obligations. If you think about it like a privacy notice, you say, I'm telling you this stuff because Europe says I have to.
This is going to happen. Tick yes.
Exactly. And it's actually saying, and you're seeing that in California as well, it's actually saying that your rights are important to us. We treat our duty of care with your data very seriously. And these are our sort of brand values. These are our principles around it. And these will accompany you through your journey with us as a customer. I think that's what GDPR is doing in that respect, is rewriting the balance. But it's a really big deal. I think some people have thought GDPR, it's going to sort of sink into the background. It's not. I really do think it's a sea change.
So one thing that we're doing that is actually something I try not to do, and I've been terrible about it this whole episode, is we've been saying GDPR, GDPR, GDPR. And that's the way most folks sort of out on the web and working and building products are going to experience it. This gently opaque 4-letter acronym that stands for this European legal directive. But when we're talking about GDPR, we're talking about the General Data Protection Regulation. And that makes a lot of sense to me. These are regulations about how we hold and protect and do things with data very generally. When I see people talk about and when I see people discuss and interrogate what GDPR means for individuals, I really hear them talking about it not in those massive list of 99 articles, not in that very, very dense legal language, but talking about it in like 8 rights, the 8 main rights that the GDPR gives to individuals whose data is being bought or sold or processed or held. I was wondering if we could talk about those a little bit.
Sure. I mean, as you mentioned, there's a number of rights which are enshrined in GDPR. And I think it can be easy to view them in isolation, but I think, again, it helps me to think about those rights are about the sort of the life cycle of data as it is captured and then sort of moves through your organization. One of the key rights, which is a big change with GDPR, is the right to be informed. It's long been a truism that if you're getting something for free on the internet, you are the product. We've all got used to, as technologists, when we've been working on a project, I'm ashamed to say that it's often been the last thing that we've done in terms of the deliverables, has then to get a privacy policy and then like bolt it onto the site or the app or whatever you're doing. It's been the sort of Cinderella of tech. That's changing. If we're going to do a deal around data with open-minded citizens, then the right to be notified about what is going to happen with your data is absolutely key. And that's actually going to stand you in really good stead for respecting all the rights down the line. So this promotes your privacy policies to your shop window. This is where you talk about how it's going to be like to work with you as a company and a custodian of the data. So I think that's a really key right. The other key right is a right to access. Now, if you think about our complex sort of daily lives, hundreds of different organizations, from our sort of mobile providers through to like car rentals to charities or whatever, they've all got copies of our data. All of those copies of our data have inherent risk of breaches, which we're starting to see more and more. And in many cases, we're not aware of where those are. GDPR makes it clear that you need to be able to request your data from any organization that you believe holds it. This is a real operational challenge for a lot of organizations, because not only do you need to provide a means to facilitate that, and at the moment we've sort of got send us an email privacy at organization. That's not really going to scale. I mean, we're seeing that requests around this go up by over like 110% in the first 6 months after GDPR. People are realizing that GDPR, these rights are not only something that we enjoy, but I actually think one of the biggest impacts of GDPR is going to be how aggressively citizens wield these rights, that they can be used as a weapon.
That is absolutely me, I'm afraid. So we've touched on the first two rights of GDPR, the right to information, the right to know that your data is being collected, what people are doing with it, those privacy guidelines. And then the right to access, the right to say, hey, show me the information you hold on me. And for me personally, you've talked a little bit about consumers or users wielding that as a weapon. That's absolutely what I do. So if I get an email from a company I've never heard of that shouldn't have my email address, I am absolutely going to send them a GDPR subject access request and say, hey, how did you get my email? Explain this.
Good for you. And I think that's becoming increasingly more mainstream. And actually, there's been a reaction amongst, certainly in ad tech, but also in technology and even some of the privacy community, that if you're making one of these requests, you must be one of a couple of categories. You must be like a disgruntled ex-employee, or you're an investigative journalist, or you're sort of like a privacy nut. Actually, what we're seeing is that these rights get more widespread. And that's the thing, that, this GDPR was the first regulation that really got promotion behind it. The regulators really campaigns around advertising and educating the populace. A scenario that people make a subject access request in may be that, I've received some unexpected marketing. It may be that I'm concerned about a breach. I may just be curious about where my data is, because our data is being used so far and wide that I often think it's almost a sort of phantasmagorical sort of situation where I'm going, did I give my data to that company? I can't remember. And at the moment, they're keeping tally. I think subject access rights in particular are a really, really good way, both for citizens to start to get wise, and also for external third parties, if you're a regulator or an auditor, to test the operational efficiency of an organization. If they're not responding appropriately or adequately with one of these rights, it's quite likely that they're going to fall down on some of the other rights too, like deletion.
So not only can I or you or our dear listener, not only can they insist on being informed about their data being taken or their data being used or held, we can also ask for details on that data. We've also got the right of rectification, which the way I understand it just means once you request your data, or if you know that the data someone holds on you is wrong, you could just request they fix it. I always see the right to rectification as the right to make this better, or the right to keep this honest.
That's right. I mean, that's a really good point. The thing that doesn't get talked about, and that actually may really move the needle on all this privacy stuff, is that a lot of the privacy infringing practices around ad tech and data-driven marketing it's also a statement of fact that a lot of the data that companies hold about us is incorrect. And it means that advertisers are wasting their money on incorrectly profiled users. I mean, in my day job, we have an app which helps people exercise one of their right to access. And what we find is that when people use it, the number one request they come back to us with is that when they get their data back, they say, hey, this was wrong. This phone number that you had for me has a US prefix, and I'm based in Belgium. How do I get back to the company and let them know that this is wrong? So I think, that right reflects that we don't want to have nuclear relationships with organizations that have our data. Just because we're asking about our data doesn't mean that we just want to jump to delete. But the right to rectification, actually, if you think about how CRM's developed, it's been very much, I harvest data about an individual, about Gilbert, and then I refine that data and I blend in some other data. How much more powerful would CRM be if Gilbert is given the tools and the visibility to actually say, yeah, I'm Gilbert, and this is the correct data about me. And at the moment, I'm interested in a Wi-Fi router because my old one's caught fire or whatever, or because it's insecure. And so at the moment, I'd like you to sort of quote me happy and give me some heads around that. But I'd like to be in the driving seat. Whereas up till now, it's felt very much that when we've walked into a shopping mall or we've accessed Wi-Fi, that we just had large amounts of our data. We've sort of been cracked over the head and had our data taken off us and then shot back.
Throwing it into the void.
Yeah, exactly. And it's about taking back control of that data. And rectification is, again, at the moment, it's not being used as much as some of the sort of the right that's obviously being used most often at the moment is access, because without knowing where your data is, you can't start that journey. But rectification helps you stay on the right course.
And the first right we talked about was the right to information, the right to be informed and to consent to your data being used. The next one I want to touch on is one I think that's really valuable, because consent only means something useful when it's active and when it's ongoing. With GDPR, folks now have, folks in Europe and I guess Britain for now, let's see, and different areas impacted by GDPR have the right to withdraw that consent when they decide to.
That's absolutely right. One of the key challenges is that, I think it's fair to say that we got to a situation where consent had been sort of stretched to breaking point. You had consent for all sorts of different activities being captured via a sort of a long form privacy statement where you just basically say, yeah, I agree, whatever. And there's famous things about people putting Easter eggs in privacy policies, but buried in there would be like, I'll give away the soul of my firstborn child and stuff like that. Techie humor.
Totally normal stuff.
Exactly. Too much Dungeons and Dragons at an early stage in their lives, I think. And I'm guilty of that too. Staying on the topic, consent really needed, it was in danger of becoming debased. And I think one of the key things in GDPR about getting to grips with GDPR is that you need to get serious about consent. And also, if you're using consent as a legal basis for processing data, then you need to make it as easy for the citizen, the consumer, the data subject, whoever you want to call them, to also withdraw that consent. That means that if it's in an online context, first of all, when you're capturing consent, things like that we got used to back in the day, like pre-tick radio buttons and things like that saying, yeah, I'm cool with this, are not good enough. And I'm shocked over a year down the line, I still see examples of this pre-tick boxes. We also need to have a clear call to action and a mechanism to withdraw that consent at any time for it to be valid. That's one thing to achieve that in your interface, but the much bigger challenge for organizations is to flow that through into all the different processes and all the different partners. Because if you're sharing data with a third party, then you need to make sure that when I withdraw that consent, that's withdrawn from all the other people in the chain. I think consent shows that one of the things about GDPR and getting serious with it is that you are only as strong as the weakest link in the chain.
A really similar right, one that feels very overlappy almost. We've just talked about the right to withdraw consent, but under GDPR, users also have the right to object. So not just to withdraw consent, but to object to very specific types of uses. You'd say, okay, well, I did want to visit your website and I did want to buy this thing, but I object to you using this data in your marketing channels. I object to you selling this on. You can object to very specific types of use of your data, if I understand correctly.
That's right. One of the main types is objecting to automated profiling. One of the things that GDPR was trying to battle with was this sort of a feeling of creepiness. Humans are evolved socially to use different cues, and we're pretty good at working out when someone's oversteps a mark face to face and moves into sort of creepy mode or stalker mode or inappropriate mode. That's much harder to do when it's in an online context and using data and using algorithms. The right to object gives us the right to call a stop on whatever is happening on our data and not necessarily having to object to that, have to specify that in too much detail. I think we're going to see, again, it's one of the rights which isn't used so actively beyond a certain community of sort of very data aware people. Again, what we're starting to do with these rights is thinking, which one of these rights are really going to go mainstream? And I think the right to call a halt to it for whatever reason is going to be increasingly important.
And we've been talking about 2 or 3 rights that are really closely overlapping. So the last one we looked at was the right to object. The next one feels very much like a distilled version of that. You can specifically object. You have the right to object to automated processing. And for me, both working in the tech industry and working with a company that's very, very privacy minded, but also this conversation has kind of suggested to me that I might be a bit of a privacy nerd myself, where you're like, oh, this is really only used by people who are really into privacy. I was like, oh no, that's me.
There's nothing wrong with that.
We have the right to object to automated processing. We can say, we don't want you to take our data and throw it in a big data lake and then do weird magical things to it.
That's right, because we don't know the ultimate consequences of that profiling. The background to this is that in the States in the 60s and 70s, there was great concern about redlining, about geographic information around communities being used to deny those communities access to particular products and services. There's a real concern that data and processing is being used or can be used in a similar way now. If you never see an ad for a job which may be perfect for you, but you've been profiled as not being in the right sector for, then that can fundamentally affect the future course of your life, your financial well-being. And when you think about it in those terms, it's really scary. And I think there's been a tendency in tech to follow the cult of laissez-faire and build the data and the free market will apply its own checks and balances. I think what we're seeing is that that's been shown to be outstripped by the risks. And I think this right around objecting to processing is one of those fail-safes, that we need these checks and balances to create confidence in the tech sector as a whole.
So the next one is absolutely something that ties into confidence, because this is something, so the GDPR enshrines, and I love the word enshrines. That sounds so very, very formal. That sounds like there's a data cathedral out there with GDPR on tablets. But GDPR enshrines the right to be forgotten. And I'm so excited about this right. And from my understanding, this means that when I go to a website or when I go to a company and I say, hey, because logistically, you probably have to start this process by saying, what data do you hold on me? Show me the data you hold on me. And then after you get it back, we've got all these extra things we can do with it. We can say, don't use automated processing on this. We can say, don't do this with it. Don't do that with it. One thing that I'm really excited about is the right to be forgotten. I can ask, what data do you hold on me? And then I can say, I want you to destroy this.
That's right. And it's most famously exercised by Max Schrems in the context of Facebook. I think what this illustrates again is the balance of power in your hands to reset that relationship. And it's not saying that I want to be forgotten forever, but it's actually drawing a line under your history with that organization in terms of their data. It's one of the more challenging rights because privacy is almost like a sort of a rabbit hole. You get deeper into it and you get very excited about privacy, but you then have to realize that there are a whole bunch of other regulations which also start to interlink with privacy, that my right to be forgotten may be trumped by certain other rights around, fiduciary responsibilities, if it's in the healthcare sector, anti-money laundering regulation, and even things like organizations need to retain some data in order to respect my wishes. So if I want to be unsubscribed from your mailing list, weirdly, you need to keep a list of the people who've done that. Right to be forgotten is very powerful, but it's actually starting to respect this as an organization. You need to start to have a more granular view of that data. And again, it's coming back to the spent nuclear fuel analogy. It's like put data out of harm's way where it can be forgotten safely.
And the last right we're going to touch on is something that I think is a really good one to end on, because if folks are personally interested in GDPR, if you all as users, or if you all as users who are also technologists want to know more about GDPR and want to know more about the types of data different companies and different organizations hold on you, I think you can really do a lot by exercising your first and your eighth right. To remind you, the first right is just the right to request access, to say, hey, what data do you hold on me? The eighth right, the last right we're going to be talking about, is the right to actually get a copy of that data portability. You can either say, give me a copy of all the data you hold on me, or you can say, hey, you're not my cell phone provider anymore, or you're not my, well, a doctor's a terrible example, you're not my dog groomer anymore. Please pass this along to the new person I'm working with.
That's right. And that takes us back to our initial point, was that the GDPR has sometimes been seen as a business prevention regulation. Actually, having a situation where you can sort of, English expression is like take your ball back, when you're done with a relationship, GDPR gives you the right to request that data from an organization in a easily transferable, machine readable format and hand that over to another partner to provide the same service, whether it's a dog walker or a mobile phone. And I think that is potentially a source of great opportunity for smaller players. At the moment, in certain key areas of our online life, we haven't got a great deal of choice in terms of where we go. By having data transferability, it provides an opportunity not only for us move on to pastures new, but also for organizations, small organizations, challenger organizations, to come in and say, hey, I can provide that same service and I can offer you a different data deal. Certainly, like in the UK, we've seen things like deregulation in a provision of like consumer energy services or financial services, where you've got sort of switching sites.
Yeah.
I think it's not beyond the realms of possibility that we will have similar data switching sites and services and hubs. Because when you think about a world of commoditized services and products, if I've got a choice between one mobile phone provider who's playing fast and loose with data and another one who's built their whole service around sort of privacy by design and respect for data, that's a very easy sell for me to move to that provider. But I need to be able to have my data to make the relationship work. So GDPR makes sure that organizations can't wittingly or unwittingly hold you hostage by your data. They need to provide you this data. So I think that's one of the key opportunities around GDPR, one that makes me very excited. It's not just about complaining and bitching about the current situation. It's like, okay, I'm going to take this, I'm going to move on to someone who gets this. And smart players are already keying into that space.
So this conversation has been such an exciting one to have with you. But so far, we've been talking about a lot of carrots. So we've been saying, hey, let's talk about GDPR. Here are the rights you get. Here's sort of an easy to understand overview of it. Now that we've taken a look at the carrot, let's talk a little bit about the stick. Because if you really, really screw up GDPR, if you take too much data, if you take the wrong data, there is a stick, isn't there? There's 2 levels of fines that can actually, looking at these numbers, probably put a lot of smaller players out of business.
That's true. I mean, one of the things around GDPR is another level of magnitude around fines. So between 2 and 4% of a company's turnover, which if you think about some of the big data platforms, is gigantic. We're also starting to see some of those fines come through now. In the last couple of weeks, we had something like £300 million worth of fines issued, or intention to fine issued by the UK regulator, the ICO. I actually think that the focus on GDPR, rather than putting small businesses out of business, is much more on creating a level playing field and working out some of the current imbalances. So I think the large levels of fines that we've seen have been weighted towards very large players. I think if you're a small organization, GDPR represents an opportunity to get your house in order and start to use that to punch above your weight. So there are things that you can do to mitigate the risk of fines and action. And the most important 2 things you can do, first of all, is to be accountable, to tell people what you do around data. And the second is to be responsible in how you deal with something going wrong. We're all using more and more data. So it really is almost a case of not if something goes wrong with data, but when. How you deal with that situation is very key. So the regulators have made it clear that if something goes wrong as a smaller business, they've got like things like the UK, they've got a free helpline to get in touch with them and say, I'm worried that this has happened or this may happen either now or in the past, and to start up that dialogue. That will mean that you are treated appropriately. That's taken into account way before any fines are levied. This isn't like a parking ticket, it's an ongoing relationship.
Fantastic. And you've touched on a little bit where people might be able to go to get information in the UK. Where else could they find more information on GDPR?
I mean, my relationship with privacy regulation started with the EU cookie laws back in the day. And one of the problems then was there was a dearth. There was very little information out there about what the laws meant, what we needed, how they affected us, and what to do about them. The difference now is that there's a source of really good information from the respective regulators. If you're English speaking, then the UK ICO has got some great resources in terms of breaking down some of the complex legalese into more accessible and sector-specific guides. They've got some tools and some templates. And also there's a whole bunch of different communities focused around, privacy. Also, trade associations are really useful in the UK. The DMA has got a load of free guides. And then finally, consumer associations in the UK, associations like Which have got really excellent guides, both as citizens in terms of your rights, but also as organizations in how to actually get some rubber on the road with getting serious about GDPR.
Fantastic. And if folks wanted to find, in a polite, non-creepy way, if folks wanted to track you down on the internet, where do you and where do your projects live online?
I'm on Twitter under Gilbert Hill, and my day job is I'm CEO of TapMyData. And what we provide are tools for citizens to exercise those rights that we were talking about, beginning with access. So if you go to tapmydata.com, you can download an app in Android and for Apple, which enables you to make subject access requests to start to repatriate that data safely.
Ooh.
On your mobile. And the difference is that as we're a startup, we were able to apply these principles of privacy by design. So that means that when you do this, you can be safe that we will never have your data. We don't care about your data. We don't want your data. We don't have visibility of it. And what we're trying to do is, like I said earlier, to move the needle so people can use their rights more easily, and responsible companies can respond to those rights. So it's an exciting time. So that's a place to catch me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to chat with like-minded people.
All right. So if you just hate to see this episode of the podcast end, grab Gilbert and chat directly. Gilbert, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot. You too.
And thank you for listening. We're going to go ahead and we've got some really exciting episodes in editing right now. So if you check back on the next couple of Tuesdays, we should have some really exciting things for you. Again, I'm your host, Jessica Rose.